Howdy, and welcome back to another segment of Barebow Basics. With outdoor season pretty much wrapped for all of us, we continue on our trajectory towards setting up our demonstration beginner's bow that I'll be using for this year's indoor season. Before we get there though, I wanted to stop and talk about a topic that typically confuses a lot of beginners. The selection of your first set of arrows can feel intimidating or daunting due to the huge amount of options and the variety of choices that are out there. So I'm going to go over some of my personal guidelines on what beginners should look for and how to set up their arrows. And then I'm going to wrap it up with a demonstration on how I fletch arrows so that you can have professional looking results at home. In order to better know which properties make an arrow setup more barebow beginner friendly, we first must understand what the arrow goes through at the moment of release. This is a clip that I captured for a previous segment. And while this tune is definitely not set up for me as I was borrowing my wife's bow, it will demonstrate the typical behavior of an arrow at the moment of launch. As we frame advance forward, we can see that the bowstring puts an immense compressive force on the arrow, causing it to flex and then oscillate as it continues downrange towards the target. This amount of flex is commonly referred to as the dynamic spine. And while it is related to static spine, which is how arrows are marketed, it is not the same thing. Dynamic spine will actually become a key tuning parameter that we will take advantage of in later instruction. So let's talk a little bit more about the compressive force. While the arrow would seem to be free to move on the arrow rest during release, the energy impulse that comes from the bowstring is actually so sudden and extreme that it actually compresses and flexes the arrow shaft at launch. It does this because the front half of the arrow shaft weighs just enough to offer a momentary amount of resistance. The amount of weight up front will determine how long that momentary resistance is, and thus can actually change the dynamic spine during release. We take advantage of this by using interchangeable arrow points. It's quite common for experienced barebow archers to have a points case like this one as part of their tuning gear. It contains a variety of field points in different weights, ranging from 75 grains all the way up to 300 grains. This allows you to quickly make adjustments on the fly at the practice range so that you can very easily ballpark whether or not an arrow shaft's dynamic spine reaction will work well with your personal setup and release style. Taking advantage of that flexibility, though, requires an arrow shaft that accepts screw-in points. This is why I always recommend to beginners that they choose an arrow shaft either in the standard inner diameter range of 0.245 inches or the slightly reduced size of 0.234 inches. Both of those sizes readily accept screw-in points, so you can make adjustments on the front of the arrow to change its dynamic spine reaction. This allows you to keep the arrow as close to tune as possible as your shooting form and release changes and improves over time. Choosing skinnier arrows or much fatter line-cutting arrows is generally not advised because they typically use glue-in points. And the most common approach to changing dynamic spine on those is to cut the shaft. Cutting the shaft goes against what I preach to beginners of non-destructive tuning, because once you cut the shaft, it's permanent and it's very hard to put it back on. There's other reasons not to cut the shaft. Obviously, once you cut the shaft, you can't easily sell or lend out the arrow because you've limited its dynamic spine reaction range. Additionally, keeping the arrow full length gives the weight more leverage during the compression phase. This gives you a slightly greater range of tuning and adjustability based on the amount of point weight that you use. And lastly, as a beginner, you won't be shooting at great distances. So the additional length will help reduce any unnecessary string walk crawl that you might have at shorter distances. Now let's turn our focus to the back half of the arrow. For Nocks, it's very hard to beat the quality and consistency of Nocks from Easton or Biter. I myself prefer Biter. And while they do make an insert nock that's sized to fit directly into the carbon tube, I don't generally recommend it
because as your groups begin to improve over time, you start hitting the back of your arrow. Having the knock directly in the carbon tube exposes the carbon to lateral forces during an impact that could potentially crack the arrow, rendering it entirely useless. Instead, I recommend the use of uni bushings. They're glued into the back of the carbon tube and neck the size down to a G-Knock size, or biter 12-2. You can use 1716 bushings for the 0.234 inner diameter, or the CB uni for the 0.245 inner diameter, and use either Easton G-Knocks or biter 12-2s. What'll happen then is if you get a rear impact, the aluminum helps stabilize the back of the carbon tube, and the knock breaks instead. You pull out the remnants of the broken knock, replace it with a new one, and go on about your day. The other major component on the back of the arrow is your fletching. And while it may seem cool, fun, or popular to use something like a wing or a vane, for beginners, I still always recommend feathers. They're tried and are true, and the best part is they fold down if there's any kind of contact, which happens pretty often for a beginner because either the arrow is not perfectly tuned to their form is changed, or they have a release mistake that causes the arrow to kick close to the arrow shelf or the arrow rest. Now, this does make them consumable items because they do wear down as a natural product, so they do have to be replaced periodically. In order to facilitate this, I implore that all beginners use arrow wraps. If you glue the feather directly to the carbon on the shaft, when it comes time to refletch, someone with a sharp razor has to sit there and scrape them off. This increases the risk of damaging the carbon on the shaft itself. If you wrap the shaft first and then glue the feathers to the wrap, when it's time to refletch, you just have to peel off the wrap, clean it up with a little alcohol, and start over. Now, a lot of people don't want to buy wraps because they think they're expensive, and I'm going to let you in on a secret. Arrow wraps are made of a material called Oracal 651. It's the same stuff that's used in the Cry-Cut vinyl cutting machines to make stickers. And you can buy it by the roll on Amazon for like 12 bucks. If you don't want that much, you can go to a craft store and buy a 12-inch by 12-inch pre-cut sheet. And if you just slice it up into 1-inch stripes yourself, you can make them for less than a dime each. And you can get probably close to 2 dozen arrows out of that 12-inch sheet. The last topic I want to cover is static arrow spine, or the very commonly asked question of, what arrow spine should I start out with? The confusion arises because pretty much every arrow spine chart, or at least every one that I've ever seen, isn't calibrated properly for barebow. It's really geared towards Olympic recurve. What complicates things is that many barebow archers run their shafts full length, which, as you learned in this segment, dramatically changes your dynamic spine reaction. Instead of relying on an arrow spine chart, I recommend speaking to experienced barebow archers, especially those that have previously or are currently shooting at about your draw weight off the fingers at about your draw length. That'll give you a much better idea of what spine you really should be gearing towards. Then, instead of going out and buying a dozen of those, talk to a good archery shop. The better archery shops will order or sell you individual shafts, so you can buy 2 or 3 of your target spine, and then 2 or 3 of the spine that's stiffer, and 2 or 3 that the spine is a little bit softer. With what you're going to learn and what we started to discuss in this segment, you'll be able to experiment with all 3 spines to find the correct dynamic reaction that you need for your form and your release. Once you figure that out, you can then go buy another half dozen and fill out your quiver. It really is that simple. Before we begin the fletching tutorial, I wanted to quickly share some of my personal thoughts on building and fletching arrows. It can be a very enjoyable side aspect to the hobby because you get to customize and build the arrow to look exactly the way you want. However, if you're not careful and you choose the wrong adhesives or the wrong equipment, it can quickly become a frustrating and messy endeavor. I always recommend the use of a gel-based CA or super glue. This type of glue will stay where you put it and not run all over the place, which some have found ends up gluing their fingers together. In addition, I use a CA accelerator or kicker. This helps cure that cyanoacrylate glue instantaneously on contact. This is available at archery shops and model hobby stores pretty much anywhere. For fletching equipment, I always recommend a Bitzenberger jig or a Jojan. Using a plastic contraption generally lacks precision and makes it harder to place the fletching repeatedly in the same exact spot from arrow to arrow. Any concerns you may have about it taking too long to build an arrow using a single fletch jig are resolved with the use of the adhesive because they cure instantly. So even a single fletch jig can whip out an arrow in just about a minute, as you'll see in a little bit. The last topic would be make sure your workspace is clean and contaminant free. Wash your hands to make sure there's no oil on them because these generally are the #1 thing that ruin a fletching job. So let's get started. Okay, first we're going to make some arrow wraps. I've taken the liberty of cutting a 7-inch section off of my roll of Oracal. This is Oracal 631. It has a lower strength adhesive than Oracal 651. It will peel a little bit easier, but I generally use 651 for long-term installation. There's a grid on the back that helps you make sure you cut nice square edges, but since I'm using the entire piece from the roll, that's 12 inches, I'm going to cut 7-inch long strips off. To know the correct width, if you're obsessive like me, you'll actually use a micrometer, measure the outer diameter of the arrow, and then multiply it by 3.14 to get its actual circumference. And then I'll usually add about 0.05 inches. That'll give me a nice overlap that's not too crazy, but not just barely touching. And I use the inner measuring points like this and like this. Then I know exactly where I need to cut. There's one. Because I've locked the micrometer in place, I can just repeatedly use my inner points to my inner points. Hopefully you're seeing that. That's these 2 points here. Lock it down and cut. Oop, didn't press hard enough. There's 2. They were rolled off the table. Sorry about that. And we'll do 3, just for good measure. There we go. And so on and so forth for as many as you need. Okay, so now your arrow wraps are cut. It's time to install them. If you cut them from a roll like I did, they might have some memory curl, so you do need to remove that. All I do is run my fingers down the length of it and pull with a slightly reverse curl as I go. You can see it starts to relax it. And if you do it enough times, eventually get to a point where it pretty much lays flat like that. You want to make sure your work area to your dominant side of your mouse pad is clear because you're going to be rolling your arrow up in that direction. Okay, so it needs to be clear of obstructions. To get a handle on the Oracal wrap without touching the adhesive and potentially ruining it, I've learned to use a piece of painter's tape. You take the tape and you fold it over on itself, like so. This creates a non-sticky part and a sticky part. And you take the sticky part and you put it on the non-dominant side's lower corner. So for a right-hander, in this case, it's like this. And what that does is helps you to peel the Oracal off the backer very easily and lay it flat. You can see how nice and flat that lays. And gives you a handle to control it without having to touch the adhesive. And then it gets stuck to your hands or causes all sorts of contamination issues. You want this flush with the edge of the mouse pad because you want space hanging over so that you can control the back of the arrow with the knock. Okay? And we're going to basically take the arrow, position it so that the end of the corner is lined up with the back of the carbon tube. And we're going to push straight up into it till it touches, like so, and then just roll with moderate force. You can see this 631 doesn't want to stick as readily, which is why most people use 651. This stuff lets go a little bit too easy in my opinion. But I had it left over and I like the color, that's why I decided to use it. It's part of the whole customization thing. And then you save the tape because you're going to need it for the next arrow. But that's it. It's really that simple. With the shafts wrapped, we're ready to begin fletching. One of the biggest challenges when you're first learning to fletch is setting up your jig for optimal placement and offset of your feather. With experience, it becomes easier. But when you're first learning and trying to figure it out, it's always better to use double-sided feather fletching tape. This allows you to do a temporary install of the feather on the shaft while you experiment with the settings on your jig. If you don't get it right, you can just peel the feather off, remove the tape, and try again. I have my jig set up for a slightly right offset. This means the arrow will rotate clockwise when viewed from behind as it travels downrange. As a result, I use right wing feathers. If you want the arrow to travel in a counterclockwise rotation when viewed from behind as it travels downrange, you need left wing feathers. You can tell what a feather is by looking at it from behind. A left wing feather will form the shape of an L with the base. A right wing feather like this one is obviously the opposite. I've also marked my clamp because I know exactly where I want the base of the quill to be. This is where my consistency on the arrow build will come from. So I'll load up the feather so that it hits my mark. I'm going to prep the arrow shaft now. This is where the accelerator comes in. We put the accelerator on before, not after. We spray it on a towel and we generously wipe the arrow shaft. This will leave a moist sheen on the arrow wrap. It will dry, and that's okay. The chemical residue is still there, and we're going to rely on that to do the activation. I'm going to take my gel-based super glue. I use Gorilla brand. It's what we have around here. And with my feather in position, I'm going to put a very small amount of glue along the base of the quill. Don't overdo it. This is where most beginners make mistakes. Okay. Then I'm going to take a paper towel, fold it into a point like this. This is where the great looking results come from. Hold it at about a 45-degree angle like this and swipe along the length of the base of the quill. This distributes the glue evenly and removes any excess. Flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. What you're going to end up with, the camera catches this, is a pointed ridge that runs down the length of the base of the quill. It's a very thin, pointed ridge that runs all the way down. We're going to put it into the clamp. The Jojan doesn't have a magnet, so just bump it against the slot. On the bits, I hold it against the magnet, I bump it against the bottom, and then I just rotate it into place. I squeeze and I hold for about 5 seconds. This allows the chemical residue of the activator to accelerate and cure the super glue instantly. That locks the feather in place and we can rotate. We'll clamp up our next feather. Again, hit our same indexing mark. Apply a thin amount of glue. Again, don't overdo it. This is where most beginners make the mistakes. Take our pointed towel and swipe at a 45-ish degree angle up along the base of the quill. Flip it over. Do it again. Again, I don't know if the camera's going to see this, but hopefully the resolution is there. Up against the magnet. I'm pushing down on the arrow to make sure that the nock is seated in the receiver. I bump the clamp against the bottom, and then I rotate into place. Apply some pressure so the feather is pushed against the shaft for about 5 seconds. The glue cures almost instantly. Pull the clamp and rotate. Number 3. It really is that fast, and with practice, it really is that easy. Don't be discouraged if your first few arrows don't come out perfect. Maybe you put a little too much glue on. Maybe you moved something while you're clamping it and it cured instantly in the wrong place. It's okay. With experience, you'll get it perfect. I promise. These techniques work. Okay. Magnet. Press in. Bump the bottom. Rotate into place. Hold for a few seconds. And she's done. Now, there's one other thing that I generally do to increase durability. If you take your glue, you can do something called tipping your feather. And that's where you want to create a bubble of glue at the tip of the bottle. Put it right on the tip of the feather base quill. Just like that. Do it for all 3. And what this does is it protects the tip in case of impact with the arrow shelf or plunger or arrow rest wire, so that it can't peel the feather up and ruin your fletching job. But that's it. That's how quick and easy you can produce a great looking feather on an arrow with these techniques. A few final thoughts on arrows before we close out this segment. While you may enjoy building and fletching arrows as much as I do, you do have to remember to always leave at least one shaft as a bare shaft that's unfletched for each spine that you decide to test with. This is going to become an incredibly useful and important tuning tool later on, as you'll see in future segments. Also, resist the temptation to spend exorbitant amounts of money on arrow shafts. I see too many people trying to chase points by spending $12 or $15 or more dollars per arrow shaft, thinking it will improve their shooting. More often than not, the archer cannot outshoot the arrow. So even a reasonably priced arrow can perform very well as long as the archer is doing their job. This is especially true for beginners who are still finding their form and their alignment. Having a top dollar arrow will not increase your score in any way, shape, or form, and it will just increase the aggravation or frustration when you inadvertently lose or break an arrow, which is part of the learning process. As always, thanks for joining us, and I look forward to sharing more information with you in future segments.